Welcome to a special edition of 2 Men in the Middle. I'm Craig Huey.
I'm Brandon Kinnig.
And I'm Mike McCammon.
And you have the three of us here, and this is our warm-up pre-election special. We're going to be doing some election coverage on Tuesday night, some reaction to the presidential and all of the other races. We thought we'd get together before then and kind of try out technically how we're going to record this, and also record everybody's thoughts kind of going into the election. Have you guys been able?
And for the record, didn't you have the most problems getting this working, Craig? Of the three of us, isn't that right?
No, that is not true. For the record, we're using a third-party piece of software. Mike, what I was having trouble with is my mixing board. These are two totally different technologies.
Okay, all right.
Mike, I would think with your long and illustrious career in tech, you would know the difference in that.
Well, if I could reach my hands and sprinkle pixie dust all the way up by the airport, I would, but I'm a little far south of there right now, so I can't help you.
Mike, it's fair to say that you and I live in the absolute far extremes of the city.
Right. You live on the edge of town, and I live on the other edge of town. North
and south.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me start with, have you guys watched any of these Trump rallies or the Biden rallies? Everybody seems like this weekend they're absolutely kind of barnstorming the upper Midwest. Trump is kind of doing his typical thing. Have you guys seen any of these rallies, and do you have any reaction to the kind of this midnight last ditch effort to get your point across?
Well, I was listening to your podcast last week, and I think Brandon may have mentioned it, but are there any undecided voters left? I don't know. It seems like these rallies are really just for the get
out the base.
Yeah, exactly. There's no one going in saying, well, I'm really undecided. Let me see what they have to say to make a decision. It doesn't seem like that's happening unless I'm wrong.
And I think you're right about that, Mike. And virtually everybody that turns out to these rallies are the diehard supporters for each side. You don't have undecided people that are going to go to a rally and wait, 3 hours to get in, a couple hours to get out of the rally.
Right. Get caught in the cold, waiting for a bus, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. That's not going to be the lukewarm supporters, even, let alone the undecided voters. So those are going to be just the diehard, 30% for each side that, is willing to do that.
And Brandon, we ask this question every time Trump has a rally or does any type of mass communication. What's his message right now, and who is it for? And if you're looking through or if you're watching some of those rallies that he's putting on, it's still really unclear about what his closing message is, what is his final argument, how is he crafting that argument, and who is that message for?
He doesn't have one. His main argument is, to be spread fear tactics about Biden, and the warnings about socialism. He doesn't have a second term agenda, a vision that he's put out there that he's trying to run on. And if anything, he's trying to just, I think, grab onto, I think, pieces of conspiratorial issues that his supporters gravitate to. And I think a great example would be over the weekend when he called out, basically accused doctors of inflating COVID numbers. And the AMA actually called him out for that. But that's just an example of playing to, the fringe of his base and trying to get them worked up.
Hey, I was offline for the last 36 hours or so. Did they ever find the contents of that UPS letter to Fox over the weekend?
No, they did not. But Tucker did come out and say, thank God he made copies of it.
So, he did. He did say that.
Where are the copies in? Well, would he have released them by now?
Times you would think.
We don't know, Brandon. Tucker. Once the dog eats your homework, there's really no place left to go. I tell you what, the only thing that caught me with these rallies this weekend is last night, his last rally in Pennsylvania. It was on TV, and I think I just kind of glanced by. It literally looked like he had 10 to 15,000 people there. Now, I think the idea of holding these rallies in COVID actually works against him. There is obviously no message to these rallies. There is no coherent closing argument he's making. But I did have a massive 2016 flashback just looking at the size of the crowd. And it did make me stop for a second and just say, once again, I don't put much stock into enthusiasm. One enthusiastic vote is the same vote as when somebody holds their nose and votes for someone. but it did give me kind of pause and make me stop. Am I setting myself up again for another disappointment? Brandon, looking at crowd sizes and stuff like that, are we past that with the polling, or is it fair to still kind of be stuck to the feelings of anxiety that you feel over 2016 when you see a large crowd listening to Trump?
Okay, there's a two-part answer to that. And I think number one, it's fair to have anxiety based on 2016, because I don't think any of us have 2016 out of memory and knowing how that went down. And you're right. I mean, Trump is able to have these large crowd sizes and continue to attract them. But there's a number of things to keep in mind. That number one, that these crowd sizes, again, are not reflective of turnout and what we're seeing in terms of turnout on a state-by-state basis from those who are voting, first of all. Second, you have to remember that his crowds going back to over the last 4 years, people forget that he has groupies basically that will follow him from state to state. So there's a segment of his base that travels and will go and follow him based on where he's holding rallies. So the rallies themselves are not always indicative of, local voters solely showing up, and supporting him. It's more akin of somebody showing up and following a entertainer or rock star as they travel throughout the country.
So is this akin to the Grateful Dead? Because I always hear people talking about how great they are, and I don't know anyone that's ever gone to see them, but there's obviously a clear bunch of people that used to go follow them around all the time.
Right? Are you opening a package of cookies or something while we're doing that? Once again,
sounds like it.
I have violated the integrity of the pod. I'm sorry about that. Let me cut off the peanuts while I'm at it.
Mike, stop doing whatever you're doing. Well, now that you've done it, what were you doing?
I have some trail mix, man. I'm hungry.
So, like you said, you were camping for the last 3 days or whatever. You weren't up in Pennsylvania following Trump from site to site, were you?
No, I was driving down I-35 trying to drive buses off the highway was what I was trying to do. So that's not true, by the way. That was not me.
That wasn't you?
No.
So I think we all kind of agree that these rallies are mostly for Trump. Yes, there is a small group of people that are very much enthusiastically there, like they were in 2016. But the circumstances are different, and they certainly don't have the same impact that they did 4 years ago.
They're not. And to add some substance to that, Craig, for our listening audience, there's some statistics behind that and why we should not be as worried. If you look at the early voting numbers so far, you have over 65%. I think we're getting close to 66% of the electorate, 2016 electorate nationally that has already voted, which is huge. You have well over 107% in Texas. You're over 90% in Florida. North Carolina over 92%. And then if you look at the breakdown, in most of these states, Democrats are ahead of Republicans for total votes cast already, which is great. But the other number to look at is for those that have applied for mail ballots. If you look at the breakdown of Republicans versus Democrats, the return rate in most of these states of those mail-in ballots so far is higher for Democrats than Republicans, which means there are more Republican ballots, mail ballots that are out there that have not been returned and received. So that should be cause of concern for the Republican Party in terms of being able to track those down. And then second, we should also look at the breakdown by age. We have several states where young voters, as a percentage of the population, are turning out in far greater numbers voting early than they did back in 2016, which also signals an interest and enthusiasm that can't be measured solely by Trump's crowd size.
Yeah, I have been burnt by youth votes so many times.
Yeah, you can't count.
I agree with you that I think it's higher, but for me, that's always a big wait and see.
Well, it is, but it is higher, and we saw in 2018 it was the highest in a midterm than I think over the past 50 years. And so the early vote turnout for young 18 to 30-year-olds in 2018 was a harbinger of a large turnout overall. So again, I think there's patterns we can deduce from that. So I'm not saying that it's going to be the most significant and seal the deal, but that is extremely encouraging. I mean, you can't help but see those numbers. I mean, you're talking about 7 times as many young people turning out to vote early this year compared to 2016 in Texas.
Do you think it's fair, though, to, you're kind of inferring, Brandon, that the young vote's going to vote for Biden, not for Trump?
Well, I mean, they are. I mean, there's a question about margin, but I mean, Trump did not win the young vote in 2016, and a Republican hasn't won the youth vote. I mean, going back, I think you'd have to go all the way back to Reagan's presidency, was the last Republican president who actually won the youth vote in '84. And the youth vote, I think there's been times when it's been closer. Like I think in 2000, it was a 55-45 breakdown between George W. Bush and Al Gore. But really, since 2008 in the Obama era, that youth vote the Democrats have captured more and more of it and have continued to do so. So you're right. I mean, there's going to be a portion of that youth vote, obviously, that is voting for Trump. But based on all of the polling we've seen, based on what we saw in 2016, it should be anywhere from a 66-33 split to higher for Biden.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, I don't see any way Trump tops 20%, 15% of the youth vote. I think if he did anything over 20, that would be huge. Mike, give me something as you sit down to watch this election. This is certainly not your first rodeo on election night. What are the things that are going to be most interest to you early in the evening?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'm going to be watching for is for things, these kind of the states where everyone kind of believes, there's like, oh, these are not just leaning or toss-ups that they, if the map stays kind of to plan, except for these, toss-up states, that'll be the first thing I watch for. I mean, I think that it's going to be hard for Kansas to do something outrageous, but and I don't expect this to happen. But if, the senatorial race in Kansas were to flip to Barbara and it would get called early, then I would say, oh my God, this is going to be like nothing we've ever seen before. Trump's going to get run out. I mean, that's just going to be.
Let's talk about that local election. Did anybody see that commercial today?
Yeah, I saw it.
That is.
Yeah, I saw it as well.
Devastating.
What do you think, Brendan? I don't know how devastating it is.
Are you kidding me? A Kansas Democrat can't answer a basic question on taxes. That is a non-starter. And how do you run for statewide office in Kansas as a Democrat and not know every single tax answer cold? That was ridiculous. That was amateur.
I think it was a brain fart. It was a brain fart. It happens.
It happened 3 times during a debate for a Senate seat. That's not how a serious candidate answers that question. Go ahead, Brandon.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's bad. I don't agree necessarily that it's devastating, just because that's been out for a while now. And based on the polls that are out, the polls still show it within as a margin of error race. I think more of the polls have shown Marshall ahead than have shown Barbara ahead or tied. But all of the polling so far still indicates margin of error, 4 points or less, all of the credible polls. So, I mean, I think it's still, again, it shows how polarizing this race has become. I think it's still going to come down, to the very last votes that are counted, and Johnson County turnout and margin really is what's going to determine that race. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, that's not the only mistake. I think that Barbara's response on guns, which has been, put in many ads, has also was a self-inflicted wound.
Let me just double down on that. So she messed up the tax question and the gun question in Kansas.
Yeah, the gun question was basically, she was at had an outdoor event and was asked about gun laws, and she praised Australia, for having a complete and total gun ban. Yeah. And so, I think that was also a self-inflicted wound. But, and that's been out for a while. But again, and I thought at the time, I thought, well, that's it. The race is over. But again, we didn't really see a whole lot of change in the polling after that. I mean, very little. So that didn't seem to move the needle, so to speak. I still think it's Marshall's race to lose, but it's still close enough to where anything can happen. I will say this, and I don't know if you agree with this, Mike. Trump's margin of victory in Kansas is going to be less than 2016. He won 56-44 in 2016. I've already said it's going to be a 53-47. We're talking about a single-digit margin this year. I could easily see that being the case.
Yeah, I mean, the things that Yeah, I mean, to me, the fact that Marshall and Barbara's campaigns and all the kind of like helper PACs keep, pummeling us with TV ads makes me think it's pretty close. If someone was trying to run away with it, they would stop spending their money and spend it like in South Carolina or someplace else. But they're not. They keep spending it here. So, and I mean, the thing that I keep looking at is, we need to remember it was 88 years ago when Kansas had someone that was not a Republican as a senator. So the fact that she gets within a couple points is actually quite remarkable. I know that talking with my Democrat friends, I mean, their plan was to try to take Laura Kelly's playbook and try to recreate it, where basically you have to win 7 counties in Kansas, and the rest of them, if you just don't, get blown out in those other counties, you should be okay. But I don't know. I think that it's risky. But again, when I started this conversation by saying, I'm going to be watching the map for things that we are expecting to happen, and if anything goes sideways, like is completely unexpected, because I personally think that all these swing states, even Florida, Michigan, name them all, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, this is going to be Florida 2020. We're not going to know jack on election night, because even if they declare a winner, they're going to fight about it in the courts for 2 or 3 months. So I just hope, and I hope that it is just a complete rout. So at least people will get the message that they need to stand down and stand by, as opposed to, doing something stupid.
I agree with that, Mike. And I think that the one thing that could make it a rout, or at least not make, states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan obsolete, but put less pressure on the post-election legal fights, would be if we do see any combination of Texas and Georgia flipping. And I think that can completely be a reset in terms of expectations, because then, all bets are off. I mean, particularly Texas. I mean, if Texas goes Dem and Georgia, but I would argue of the two, despite what we're seeing in Texas, I think Georgia is probably more likely to go Republican, just based on the African-American turnout so far this year, which has been above average.
You say Georgia would go Democrat or Republican?
Democrat.
Okay, yeah.
Because Trump only won Georgia by 5.7 points in 2016, and that was with lower turnout among African Americans in 2012.
So I took us down this Barbara Bollier rabbit hole. Let me close this up. Barbara Bollier loses by +7. Any takers?
I think it'll be less than that.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to call that she gets a late, there's a late rush to her opponent, and she loses that race pretty clearly. And I'm going to say too, it's based on her debate performance is why that outcome happens. Brandon, I asked Mike early things that he's watching. Same question to you. What's the early indicators that you're going to be looking at while you're in the Batcave of how the night's going to go?
So for me, I'm going to be looking at turnout in specific counties in some of these states. So in Florida, I'm going to be looking at turnout in Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward counties. So that's the population center of Florida, and also the Democratic strength. I'm also going to be looking at early numbers from the Tampa Bay area and the I-4 corridor to Orlando, because that's the swing area of Florida. So if Biden is winning that fairly handily, that also would signal a good night for the Democrats. If it's closer, that's going to signal a lot of lip biting and anxiety-inducing hours throughout the night. I'm also going to be looking at turnout in Georgia and Atlanta, and what some of those early numbers look like coming back, especially once we have more firm numbers on breakdowns, some of the demographic breakdowns, age breakdowns in states like North Carolina, Georgia. North Carolina and Georgia, those breakdowns matter a lot because those states have heavy African-American populations. And both of those states have critical Senate races that could swing the power balance of power in the Senate. So Georgia, North Carolina in particular, you want to look at the voting strength of African Americans, particularly as those early numbers come in.
And I think the Georgia Senate race is not getting, the two Georgia Senate races are not getting a lot of the high profile love that some of the other Senate races are. And I think the gentleman's name is Ossoff. He's the guy who is running against Perdue, if I've got that correct.
Correct.
I believe he's leading by 2.
He is, yeah. He has been leading most of the last polling by 2 or more, and there's been a noticeable shift in that, where Perdue was leading, and most of the recent polls have shown Ossoff taking a lead. The other Senate race is the one that would likely go to a January general election, because it's a jungle primary with everybody running, and that's the one where you have Kelly Loeffler and Chris Collins battling now for who's more Trumpian. And then you have the Democrat African-American pastor who's the leading in that one, but then you also have Joe Lieberman's son who's running. That one's a lot closer, and there's a lot of Democrats that are fearful that obviously if no one gets over 50%, that goes to a January runoff, and it's anybody's bet who wins. But the same one in that, the leading Democrat has also started ticking up closer to the 50% mark, although he's not quite there. So both races, I think, are interesting to watch just from the standpoint of demographic changes in the state. And there is the thought that, Georgia is becoming more blue, and this race and this election season should tell us how much more blue.
So Craig, what do you think about Mike No Mask Parsons up for Missouri governor? What do you think is going to happen there?
I hope Nicole Galloway can pull that out, but I just don't know. Parsons is just a member of the good old boy network that has seated the Missouri governor for decades. The only thing I can say with that governor race, it would have to be Trump has a very, very bad, historically bad night, and Galloway gets swept in a blue wave. But I don't suspect that to happen. I think she gets within 5 points, but I think Parsons he's just got his connections with the party just run too deep. And Missouri is a red state. I mean, you're really fighting uphill as a Democrat in Missouri. And if you look at it, this vote, so we expanded Medicare in Missouri, and basically the only places it passed were Kansas City, St. Louis, and Columbia. And I think what you'll see in Missouri is Galloway wins the 3 urban areas and Parsons wins everything else. Yeah.
That's kind of the way it's going to work for Barbara Boyer in the state of Kansas too. There's this kind of like this division of urban versus rural voters. And that's really the division, which I think you see nationally too in the US, the coastals versus the centers. And that's it's rural versus urban is basically what's happening.
And there's parts of the country where this could be the last hurrah for some of the, rural areas to really kind of make their stand. But demographically, the future is against that type of strategy where you're banking solely on rural versus suburban urban. And Laura Kelly's election was a prime example of that, because that showed that you could win just 6 or 7 counties and be able to win the state if your margins are large enough. So there's a strategy there, and that's only going to continue to shift in the favor of Democrats, because the population trends are such that more rural counties continue to bleed population year to year, and the urban counties continue to gain. And we saw that in Missouri with the Medicaid vote. That was astounding to me, that Medicaid expansion passed solely based on, what was that, 3, 4, maybe it was 5 counties total that voted in affirmative for it. Yeah.
Well, let's not forget in the state of Kansas, when it comes to, Laura Kelly, when she won the governorship, it always helps to run against one of the least popular people in the entire state.
That is true. Yeah, Chris Kobach, you could not have handpicked a better opponent.
Right, exactly. You cannot, get out the unvote easier than with having Chris Kobach as your opposition.
Yeah, I think he's proved multiple times that people in Kansas do not like him and do not want him to represent them in any office.
Oh, I expect to see him in 2 more years when Moran. Well, I guess Moran will be an incumbent, so I guess that won't happen.
Well, I brought up the Georgia election.
I guess he could run for secretary, or he could run for state or governor again. I guess in the state of Kansas.
He could. I would have put it past him. I mean, that's his life's work is running for office. So there you go.
I brought up the Georgia Senate elections just because there's a real opportunity for Democrats to pick up both of those seats, and it's a long shot, but we might know that too on Tuesday night. And if we can pick up 2 of those seats or even 1 of those seats, if that changes the nexus of the Senate considerably. Because a lot of times when people talk about how do the Democrats get to 51, they don't throw Georgia in there. So Georgia is going to be something that early on, especially the Ossoff race, That's something we need to pay really, really close attention to. Mike, give me something that is an indicator Trump's going to have a better night than you thought he was going to
have. I couldn't even tell. I mean, the only if they start calling any of these swing states for if they call more than 2 of the swing states for him, then I'm going to get very, very nervous. That was 930, 4 years ago. I can't even remember what state it was when they called him. Like, holy shit, this is not going well. But I think it's going to have to be not just 1, but 2 of them. But again, I'm really convinced that, I read an article the other day that said there's 230 lawsuits out there already filed for this year's cycle. I cannot imagine how long this is going to get litigated. I mean, I'm seeing articles that in Texas are thinking about throwing out 117 ballots for this, or, it's not small numbers, and I would expect that if Trump wins anything, or if Biden gets a surprise, it won't be by millions of votes in any of these states.
That's true. And first of all, I cannot imagine, well, I shouldn't say that because stranger things have happened, but that lawsuit in Texas, which is against the drive-through balloting that was done in Harris County, Houston, I really cannot imagine that getting all the way up to the Supreme Court, and even if it did, being upheld, that lawsuit, because this was something that the Secretary of State signed off on. This is something that Republicans did not even decide to challenge until, the last, week or so. And, there's no precedence for it because Harris County basically went and got approval from everybody that they could on the state level to ensure that this was something that they could do. There isn't any valid reason for it, but the fact that Republicans have filed this lawsuit anyway shows that they are looking for any avenue they can to have votes tossed out because they are worried. Again, I think despite all the anxiety, you would rather be the Democrats and the Republicans, because the Republicans are in the place of trying to throw out votes and suppress votes because they're fearful of where the election is headed. So I think the lawsuits tell you everything you need to know about, how they're approaching it from their side and why they're anxious and worried.
Do you think, let me ask this question. I'm going to go to November 10th. Is there any way that Trump admits defeat and concedes defeat in this thing ever?
Sure. Yeah, there is a path where he can defeat. It won't be Tuesday, but there is a path, and I think we will get there, where Trump finally says, hey, I don't think Trump will give a traditional concession speech, and I don't think the words "I lost" or "I concede" will come out of his mouth. But I think by Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we will hear Trump in some way basically outline his plan to leave the office. And then he'll go on a 90-minute grievance rant of how this was stolen from him, how he's doing this for the good of the American people, which he loves, and blah, blah, blah. But I do think we will get a point. Trump doesn't want to be a complete pariah when he gets out of the office. He's going to have legal fights. He also needs to raise a ton of money to keep his businesses afloat. I think at some point somebody will tell him the best possible way forward for you professionally and financially is to concede the race. And I think he'll do that at some point. I just want to say real quick, the state that I'm going to watch really early is Maine. So Hillary Clinton won Maine by about 3 points. Maine had Johnson and Stein, both as independents, on the ballot. Johnson got 38,000 votes. Stein got 14,000, and she won there by about 20,000. So Maine has everything that kind of went wrong for 2016, except that Hillary won that state. But it's a state that Trump is certainly, based on his 2016 performance, he can close that gap. So Maine's going to be, the first indication was the 50,000 people that voted for Johnson or Stein, where did they go? We think those people break heavily for Biden. Does that hold? And then one of the Senate seats that I'm most interested in is Susan Collins. And it might be worth it again, Brandon, for you to explain. There's some uniqueness in that kind of jungle election they're in. Can you walk through that again about why it's going to be really hard for Susan Collins to win?
It's going to be not only very hard, but almost extremely impossible for her to win, because this is the first federal election in Maine where they're using ranked choice voting. Because during the last election, Maine voters voted in ranked choice as the method of voting for all future elections. And so what that means is that there are two independent third-party candidates on the ballot running in Maine with Collins and with Gideon, who's the Democrat. And those two are to the left of the Democrats, and they're running on universal health care, kind of full progressive policy issue stances. And so anybody who supports those two candidates will get to put in their second choice. And so if neither of those third-party candidates win, which is what is going to happen, all of those votes then get transferred to the voter's second choice. And it's very difficult to see a scenario where most of those voters are going to say, we want Collins, if they're already supporting candidates that are to the left of the Democrat who's running.
Yeah. So, but at the presidential level, Maine is the first test of the theory that if you take these 50,000-ish votes that went to Johnson and Stein, it's the first test of the theory that Biden is way more likable than Hillary. He doesn't have all of the baggage that she carried with her, and those votes will break heavy to Biden.
That is true. In Maine, and sorry to interrupt, but Maine, as we know, splits their electoral votes by congressional district. And Trump was able to pick off that mostly rural second congressional district, which is northern Maine, last time around. But polling has showed Biden leading there, although be it very marginally. But there's been consistent polling showing Biden leading in that second congressional district. So if Trump is unable to pick that off, that again narrows his pathway to 270.
Drilling down into those independent voters and confirming that theory that they're going to Biden, if that theory shows itself in Maine, that's an indication that we could be hitting that historical landslide. Mike, my prediction with Brandon on last week's podcast was I'm calling this Biden in the Electoral College plus 350. I think this is a substantial win for him, and I don't think the end result is going to be in doubt much after Tuesday night. Do you feel that same way, or are you think we're headed for a closer election and a protracted legal fight?
Well, I don't know I don't know my current thinking is that while the Electoral College will show that Biden won, probably within 24 hours of the end of election day, I just am going to be very skeptical of how the next several weeks are going to go. Because I just remember the dangling chads, of Florida and how that went on and on and on, had to go to the Supreme Court. Now, of course, it was a close election. So obviously every state mattered. And that's why I'm hoping that there'll be just basically a rout, because then that way it won't matter how many of these little kind of tit for tats. It's not going to help him get to his final, the 270 number he needs. So I'm not as bullish as you. I can't remember, Brendan, where did you land in terms of electoral votes last week?
I kind of landed around that amount as well, factoring in what's happening in Georgia, because I am predicting that Biden will win Georgia. And I think I'm pretty much on the cusp of predicting that Texas is likely, although I've been hesitant to go full board into Biden winning Texas. And I do think he wins Arizona. So that is kind of pretty much where I'm landing as well. I will say, just to go back to a point that Craig said earlier, if you are Trump and you're trying to look for some good news of the night, the only thing I can think of is that you would be watching Minnesota, because if you're Trump, you've been making this late play for Minnesota and hoping that you can somehow close the margin there because of it being close last time with Hillary. I don't see that happening in any way, shape, or form for Trump. But if you're the Trump people, that would be one state you would look at.
What's different about Iowa that makes it in play? Because all the rest of us out here in the Midwest, we're all solid, red states.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Iowa has, more so than any other Midwestern state, the largest number of colleges and universities. So you have a lot of college and university kids. There's been anecdotal information about students re-registering to be able to vote in Iowa. And then people forget, up until 2016, Iowa has always been a perennial swing state. It was a state that George W. Bush lost in 2000, but won in 2004. It was the state that sent Obama, gave Obama the Democratic nomination in 2008. He won it both in 2008 and in 2012. So it's a swing state. It went so heavily for Trump in 2016, then most pundits took it out of the swing state category this year. But then the polls showed it tightening up quite a bit, and they have a very tight Senate race where in most of the polls, the Democrat has been leading, albeit in the margin of error. And then Iowa also has a high number of independents, large number of independents relative to other states as well, based on population. So I think those factors make it a swing state. It's interesting in other regards too, because it's a microcosm in many ways. You have rural farm areas, you have Des Moines, you have a lot of college and university towns like Iowa City, and why am I blanking out the four the north east Iowa area. So and then southwest Iowa is fairly conservative. So you have a little bit of everything in the state. So it's never, I think, in one party's grasp or the other.
See, I have a totally different take on Iowa. What's Iowa's number one industry? It's farming, right?
Yeah, corn, right?
Okay.
Agriculture.
It's agriculture. What is so agriculture is basically subsidized by the federal government. If there were no agriculture subsidies at the federal level, farming wouldn't exist. So as a state, Iowa basically exists because their number one industry is subsidized by the federal government. That makes them pay attention much, much more than other Midwestern states.
Kansas, Missouri, Kansas, no different.
Kansas, we can just shout out independence, freedom, low taxes, small government, and we can get away with that. Iowa can't, because if they don't have a positive relationship with the federal government when it comes to subsidizing their agricultural industry, the state goes away.
Well, I had also read, and I'm very naive when it comes to agricultural concerns, but I will say that, I also know, I don't know what the breakdown is of kind of like the cash crops of Iowa, but if soybeans are one of them, I mean, there's obviously been a big break with that, with the Chinese, basically trade battle that Trump's been going at, this idea that he wrote them a check. I don't know if you saw that in the last presidential debate, but yeah, I don't know. I don't mean to take us down the rat hole, but if Iowa were to shake out and go Biden's way, that's another early indicator that we're on our way to a rout.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we wrap this up, we wanted to do this because the podcast, or the idea for the podcast, started with the election of Donald Trump, and that was
that's true.
That was the event that set set this podcast in motion, and we've been able to keep this going for 3 years. I haven't looked up what your average amateur podcast number of episodes they get in before they tank, but I did some informal research.
Well,
I think it's about 5 episodes is typically what they make.
Well, that just might be an indicator of how stubborn or stupid the hosts are. You never know.
My point is, we can't let this election pass without kind of marking this.
Well, that's fair. I would agree with that.
This was an event that was so confusing. We decided we need to meet once a week and talk about it. And I think through the 3 years that the podcast has been on, it's only gotten more confusing as we go. Let's do final thoughts. Mike, just give us, when you sit down with your bag of trail mix in your basement, if you fire up the coverage, I'm assuming you'll be watching Fox or One America News Network or something like that. Give me your kind of mindset, your thoughts, just as you're sitting there.
I'm terrified. I'm terrified.
Yeah.
I mean, 16 was just such a stunner that you were kind of like shell shocked. Like, I can't believe this is happening. But I mean, I cannot even articulate how I'll feel if Trump makes a good run at this, because if he does, it'll really just fly in the face of what I thought the country I lived in was like. Yeah. That we have, there's norms for behavior, there's things you do, there's things you don't do, how these, crazy people that can like try to run people off the road, or as we were just talking, shoot people in Topeka, they probably go to church on Sunday. And I don't know what country we live in if we have the same result. So I have to believe people will say, and again, the good news is, and I really liked Hillary Clinton. I was a supporter of hers and I voted for her. But I can understand why a lot of people didn't want to. Hopefully that's been removed, that Biden, quote unquote, is a safe choice. The good news is Bernie's done a good job of keeping, those people in line. So, my hope is that things turn out okay. Otherwise, it's going to be very depressing.
So I think what you said was your one word was terrified.
Yes, I am terrified.
Brandon, if you had to distill your election night emotions, feelings into one word, what would that be?
Let's see, just one word. I would say anxious, because I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm anxious because, again, I feel like this is uncharted territory. We're voting in the midst of a global pandemic, which has completely, I think, usurped the way we all live and work, and so that's going to have an impact. We have more people voting by mail than ever before, and so there's the open question of ensuring that those mail ballots get to their destination in time. That's never been done before. There's all these unknowns this year, right? But what gives me optimism is the fact that there is no major third-party candidate that's going to be drawing votes away on the left. You don't have a candidate who is universally despised and hated the way you had Hillary Clinton, and then had the Comey effect, within the, late breaking within the final days. And then the other key, I think, indicator that most people, that's probably understated, frankly, is the fact that in 2016, when voters were polled who disliked both candidates, who they were leaning towards Trump. So those that disliked both Trump and Clinton. This year, the polling has been very consistent. Those that dislike both Biden and Trump are leaning towards Biden. So that's a significant change from 2016 as well that should give us hope.
What's your one word, Craig?
I'm going to go with hopeful, but I reserve the right to be terrified.
I think I go back and forth between a mix of emotions, and but would think probably most of us do.
And I think terrified, I think you expressed it well, Mike. The reason I'm hopeful is that I'm hopeful the country will reestablish itself as the country I think it is. And I'm terrified that it's not. And I'm terrified that if it's not and Trump wins, I'm not sure what my next step is. Because again, in a year that the facts have been under assault in multiple directions, this is just, if Trump wins, this would be one more piece of something that I considered to be core to my understanding of the country would be kicked away. And that's going to take some processing to figure out what that means.
A final thought, not that, anyone follows this that closely. I don't, but, I saw an article that was writing about how, what happens to the stock market when one party has both houses. Doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican, but if one party has Congress and the White House, generally speaking, the market goes down during those periods. And I also have heard, people I've worked with that are kind of really into the stock market always say that the market begins to bake in what they think is going to happen weeks before it happens. So I'm actually taking a little bit of optimistic view that because the market's been mostly down over the last couple of weeks, I think that they're preparing for a sweep, that the Dems will win the White House and Congress. And then, the whole thing then it'll be interesting to see what happens for the next 3 months where there's no rules. But I'm terrible. I mean, I just don't want to wake up on Wednesday or Thursday morning the way I felt, 4 years ago. And it would be worse this time because it wasn't like, oh shit, this just kind of accidentally happened. This will be a very deliberate hit and run. Correct. This will not be someone just got hit in the sidewalk kind of thing.
This goes from being theoretical to now you're voting with 4 years of context and experience.
Right. There's nothing that you don't know about this person at this point.
You can basically chalk 2016 up possibly as an aberration or a fluke. But if we vote again in the affirmative for Trump, it's no longer a fluke. It's a new norm. That's who we are.
Yeah, I agree. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.